of 4 continents. The idea of this panel was to bring together some parliamentarians from different parts of the world to talk about some of the challenges to modern democracy and how it affects them in their work. We have, just to my left, this is Aleksandra Wiśniewska, who is a recently elected Polish member of parliament. She is just about the youngest woman in the Polish parliament. We have Zin Mar Aung, who is a member of parliament from Burma. She is currently in exile, and she is the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs for the government, which is not in power at the moment because of military coup. And we have Zanetor Agyeman-Rawlings, who is a member of parliament from Ghana. And then we have Senator Chris Coons, who's from a small democracy known as the United States of America, and from the state of Delaware.
Which is a small state.
Which is in fact a small state, and I think is probably smaller than either Burma or Ghana or certainly Poland.
Frankly, almost any nation.
Frankly, almost anything. But nevertheless, he's here as a representative more broadly. And the idea is we have it's only a brief period of time. I thought we would begin with what you might describe as the elephant in the room. And they all know I'm going to ask this, so they've had 5 minutes to think about it. Until very recently, the United States defined itself and was defined by many others as the leader of the democratic world. It had an alliance in Europe that was based on an idea of shared values. The United States had a program of promoting democracy or talking about democracy in different places, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe. It's not clear right now whether that will continue, and there are clear signs that this administration doesn't want to pursue those policies in the same way, not least by having recently cut the funding of some of the democracy promotion organizations. And so before we move on to other questions of tech and the autocratic world and so on, I thought we would start with that, just to find out how it looks to people in different places. I'm going to start with Senator Coons because, it's his country.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to my colleagues on this panel. Look, democracy cannot be as strong and forceful, as significant, and as powerful if it is exclusively the province of the United States and if its survival depends exclusively on the United States. I think the folks who are with me on this panel are proof that the aspirations to determine your own course in life, to be free to speak your thoughts and ideas, to vote and choose your own representatives, and to control the future of your country, no matter your station in life or background, that is a universal ambition. And the American experiment in democracy looked back at and was rooted in previous experiments in democracy. And our Constitution, which is under genuine stress at the moment, we are going through a real test of how we govern ourselves and what our views are and how we're going to engage with ourselves in the world. We need the encouragement and the patience and the reinforcement of other democracies that speak to us about who we are and who we must be in the world. To the specific question of funding, in the last administration, the last Congress, I was the chair of the committee that funds all of our foreign assistance and development work. And to see the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created by Ronald Reagan, had strong bipartisan support for decades, to see the IRI and the NDI, which have long been engaged in promoting democracy in other places in the world, frozen, laying off staff, withdrawing and abandoning critical work in nations where democracy is fragile or new or at risk, is for me literally heartbreaking and hard to understand how my colleagues can accept it. This is a very present conversation. Republican colleagues are assuring me that this is just a temporary hiccup and a review of funding, and it will all be fine, it will all be restored, and this will be great. And I think the reality is different, and I don't see that many of the nonprofit organizations, human rights organizations, civil society and free speech organizations that we have long stood by and funded will survive this 90-day review. So That's the lens through which I see American democracy promotion. The vice president came and spoke yesterday, and in a speech that was very different from a speech I would have given, but I'm not vice president.
There's still time.
Don't tell my mother. She's given up, thank God. He did speak about democracy, just in a way that was the inverse of how I might have seen it. Having chosen to go to Moldova and Romania in between Christmas and New Year's because of a sense of urgency and concern about that democracy, those democracies and their path forward and their elections and their stability and their engagement with Europe and the United States, I see things very differently than Vice President Vance. But it's not that the United States, under the Trump administration, has abandoned talking about democracy. But China and Russia talk about democracy too. They talk about their elections. They talk about their constitutions. So just to end where I started, if you don't have the power to actually speak your mind in a free and fair way, to participate in meaningful elections that are openly contested, and to be a part of a robust democracy where judges are judges and where civil society is respected and where media is free, it's a democracy in name only. And I think in the United States, we're in the fight of our lives, or of the modern era, in terms of what we will be. And I hope you won't give up on us, because I certainly won't.
No, I mean, I think it's important to I maybe should have started with this. I mean, it's clearly, democracy is not just elections. Democracy is having the rule of law. It's having some degree of transparency and accountability for rulers. It's about having an independent judiciary, some kind of independent media, or some way that people can have a conversation that's not manipulated and not run by the state or by the ruling party. So that, you know, that gives us it's broad, but it's narrower than just elections. Zin Mar Aung, can I ask you to talk a little bit about the United States? And don't worry, I'll get on to other subjects too. But.
Thank you. Actually, I just wanted to mention that I am also one of the NET fellowships.
The National Endowment for Democracy. This is right.
Yes, just
this is America's democracy promotion.
Yes, it is.
Group.
Yes, actually, it was 1 year before I was elected as a member of Parliament. So I think as a democratic activist, my background, when I was as a student, so we and our generations and our people are very much committed about struggling for freedoms and democracy that against military rule since 1988. So in this regard, the role of the United States is very much meaningful, and it means a lot for us. At least during the time of the military rule, many of the activists are inspired by seeing American democracy. So I think this is the time to review, and we also would like to see America should be great against in the way of the democratic leaders, because around the world, as you can see, authoritarian regimes are quite united, but among the democratic walls, so I feel like that is separated, but I don't see democratic walls is not united enough to fight against emerging authoritarian regimes.
I want to talk about the way in which the democratic world can unite in the next round of questions. It's a really good point. Zanetta?
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks to colleagues as well. For the longest time, I guess the US was the epitome of democracy, but I think that is no longer the case, even if I can speak simply for the people I speak to. You know, we had our elections last year in Ghana, and I did a lot of legwork because I really wanted to speak to the youth, because the youth are the majority of our voters, whether we like it or not. And the problem is there's a complete disconnect with the outcome of elections and the individual aspirations of our citizens. Yet the constant reinforcement is that democracy is the way to go, and the U.S. is the picture that we should be looking at. But we're looking at the picture, and the picture isn't as clear as it used to be, you know. And so the question is, what is democracy? Now, something very interesting happened in January, just to bring your attention to how a lot of young people on the continent are looking at governance. We had our inauguration of our president, President Mahama. He was here yesterday on the 7th of January after our elections. And we had lots of heads of states and heads of delegations who came to Ghana, including Captain Traoré from Burkina Faso, who had the loudest applause. It was just so spontaneous. It didn't match up to that applause.
And the significance of that?
The significance of that is people do not trust the system based on what it's selling, because you have democratic system as it's being sold, because you have countries across the continent in the sub-region that are recognized as democratic countries. They're doing all the tick boxes of elections, and they have the judiciary, the legislative arm, the executive. But these are not delivering on the aspirations of their people. You still have extreme levels of poverty, injustice, you know, poor healthcare, high mortality rates, instability. You have, you know, the infiltration of terrorist armed groups and violent extremism. And you're constantly being told that this is the way to go. But it's not solving any of these problems. And this misconstrued, I don't know, messaging, I suppose, is not helping the youth to believe. We had a very low turnout in elections last year. And I believe that we have to look further into who didn't vote. But from what I did my assessment of, a lot of young people didn't vote because they didn't see how voting would change their lives, no matter who won. So if we're not looking at the challenges, the real challenges within what we're calling our democracy, then we're definitely losing the majority of our young people who are the future. And during my campaign, again, I'm just using these real life examples so that you understand what people are actually thinking, maybe not always saying. We had an instance where we met with a few people, and this was a young man, you know, working, doing his best, not, you know, into any kind of fraudulent thing, just a decent, upstanding citizen. And in speaking to him, he made a comment about the fact that he'd lost faith in the democratic system because of the way politicians lack the level of credibility and transparency that they hope for. And he added that if we, as in those in the political landscape, were not careful, they, the young people, were simply just waiting for one person who was willing to be crazy enough to just light the spark, and they would all come on board. This is in a campaign leading up to an election in a democratic country. So we really need to go beyond ticking the boxes. Are we really listening to what people want, or is it a case of we hear them, but we're still doing the same old thing? It's not changing people's lives for the better. It's not improving the environmental conditions. It's not improving livelihoods. The taxation, young people are being subjected to levels of taxation that are unfair because they have inherited a landscape that is created as a result of mismanagement of a generation before them. But they're paying the price. They don't even have a baseline that's commensurate to where they actually are. So even starting from scratch is worse than starting from scratch 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So democracy is not doing what it's selling. And I think that's where the biggest problem is. And I think what we're seeing in the US looks like the system crumbling on itself. And one has to wonder, should we just go back to the drawing board and look at what it means when we're talking about proper governance?
Right, so there you've had from one member of parliament from a democracy that's troubled and one member of parliament from a dictatorship, where there is no longer democracy. So there are different views. So Aleksandra Wiśniewska from Poland.
So thank you so much for having me first. It's an absolute privilege to be here with you today. So I must say that following what has been happening over the past 48, 72 hours, I've been distraught, as I'm sure many of us, and deeply disquieted, as I'm sure many of us were in this room. And Poland had, believed always that we enjoy a particularly strong partnership with the United States. We are happy to have over 11,000 American troops currently on the ground in Poland, as Poland is currently the NATO's eastern flank. We've done a lot of military investments. Where currently our military spending is 4.7% of GDP. So this is the highest amongst all NATO allies. So Poland actually puts, our money where our mouth is when it comes to the defense spending and defense budget. But I must say that, I was asking myself, Anne, what has happened that we found ourselves in this situation as Europe, right? And I thought that, for too long, we failed to define as Europeans what exit strategy for us is, what the success, 5 years down the line, 3 years down the line, 10 years down the line of the Russia versus West conflict actually is, Russian aggression on Ukraine is. And due to the fact that we didn't do it, due to the fact that we put effectively Ukraine on a drip that was sufficient for Ukraine to merely survive, to push back Russians, away from Kiev, which we were deeply fortunate that the Ukrainians managed to, because otherwise we would have had Russians behind our eastern border. Instead of, we just put them on a drip. And the failure of definition of that allowed President Trump's administration to 1,085 days into the conflict to suddenly have the agenda setter power, that, led us all to sort of to run around panicking really as Europe. So currently we have to, exactly as Madam Parliamentarian said, get back to the drawing board, ask ourselves, all right, how we as Europeans, how we as the EU pick up the slack, not only in terms of defense spending, but constant support to Ukraine, which is fighting for our values, for daring to belong to the Western world, for daring to belong to sovereign democracies, and to NATO as well. Just sort of to sum up, if I might, Poland deeply understands the threat of Russian imperialism. We were under the sort of historically under brutal rule of USSR. So what I would like to say is that we do not trust Putin, and we do not trust what is currently happening, and the phone calls that are currently happening as well. And we just like to say that for us, Donetsk is Ukraine, Lugansk is Ukraine, Kherson is Ukraine, so is Mykolaiv, so is Odessa, and so is Crimea. Thank
you. Actually, I have to tell you, that was a fascinating example of when you say America and democracy, how many different responses you get. Now, let me try another kind of Rorschach test. So I recently wrote a book. It's called Autocracy, Inc., and it describes the relationships between very disparate members of the autocratic world, a kind of coalition. It's not an alliance, it's not formal. It includes countries who have very different ideologies, nationalist Russia and communist China and theocratic Iran and so on. I think we all, I don't have to make the argument, certainly not here, that this is a coalition that begins to operate in some ways together. They help one another out. They have financial relationships with one another. They have a military relationship, which we've seen most obviously actually in Ukraine. And they also begin to create a kind of propaganda, kind of authoritarian argument, why autocracy is stable and safe and why democracy is weak and divided. I think you alluded to that actually in your comments. Could each of you reflect on how your countries, or in the case of you, your political movement, think about that world? So as is it a threat to you? Does it not matter? How do you cope with it and deal with it? And how do you see is that one of, you've all talked a little bit about threats to your democracy. Is that one of the threats? I mean, let's shake up the order this time, and maybe we begin, Zanetor, with you.
Thank you very much. So currently, Ghana has a parliamentary democracy that has lasted 30 plus years uninterrupted. First, this is the longest uninterrupted period of constitutional rule we've had since independence in 1957. We have 276 members of parliament, and out of that, 14% are women. We don't have quotas for women, for youth, for persons living with disability. We are surrounded by French-speaking countries. We also have the Sahel countries, just to the north of us. We have, constant reports of armed attacks just a few meters away from our borders. Thank God that's not happened to Ghana, but there are different reasons why. It's a very complicated thing. One of which is the fact that we've had in place a local governance system, which basically, when we have the money from the consolidated fund, when all government revenue is put together, you have specific amounts that are sent to all the local assemblies in the country, so that you don't have spaces that are ungoverned, spaces that are not provided for. And as part of the inclusivity of our democracy, we have members who are elected from within the various communities in all of these areas across the country. So it makes it difficult to have a huge gaping hole in terms of the gap between central government or the cities and the rest of the rural areas. That's one of the things that's been, of help. However, it would appear that given what we experience around us, because of the porous borders and the historical, boundaries that we have based on colonialism, you have family members on both sides of the divide, speak two different official languages, speak the same language, same family, but there's a line that's going through their house, and that makes one side Togolese, one side Ghanaian, or one side Burkinabe, one side Ghanaian, or one side Ivorian, and one side Ghanaian. So we have very interesting challenges when we're talking about porous borders. One is tempted to think about the fact that there are poor controls, but the reality is this is family on both sides. So whenever there's a disturbance on one side, people just move across to be with their families. Now, what this means as well is it means that we are very much aware of what the situation is like in other countries based on their current expression of governance or self-governance. The fact is, if you speak to the average Ghanaian, everyone wants to maintain democracy. What we are looking for is a proper definition of the pillars of democracy, good governance. We're looking for proper rule of law, and not just having the tick box of elections, but beyond elections, what's happening, development, and sticking to people's promises.
How much pressure do you feel from the Russian advance in countries near you in Africa?
Not much. I mean, it is quite clear what is going on in the sub-region between France, between the US, between Russia, and recently Ukraine as well. The unfortunate thing is that in what's going on between the West and the East and anybody else who's a known power globally, is that Africa has become the fertile land for proxy wars, and that's what's happening. And the problem, I think, if I may make reference to what Senator Coons said with regards to the US not paying attention to supporting who would be their allies in less developed countries, is that you create a vacuum, someone else will fill it up. When it comes to development, China is very high on the scale with providing support for development. So when there's a choice to be made with regards to who do you align more with, the person who seems to be supporting you a lot more so that your populations aren't dying tends to have a bigger say. However, that is not to say that Ghana does not have a strong relationship with the US. We have joint military operations that we do with the US and all of that, all in an attempt to bring some kind of stability into the region, because we are currently the only country that has not suffered from any kind of attacks. So it's a dynamic situation. But I think that in terms of our philosophy and our ideals as far as our governance system is concerned, we tend to align a lot with the US with reservations on certain things.
Zin, perhaps the right question to ask you is really about China and China's role in your country and how that's influenced the autocratic government that you have there now.
Thank you. Yeah, China is our neighbor. Actually, our country is located not just only near China, but also India, bordering India. But in this regard, China is much more actively engaged and concerned about what is happening in Burma because of their economic interest and strategic interests are in through our country, like way out to the the oceans. So, and also their landlocked state like Yunnan province is quite dependent on our northern part of Myanmar in terms of the economically and culturally, socially is very much connected. So that is why, even though initial time of the military coup 2021, China is actually not very much happy about the military coup because China needs stability in order to continue as economies as usual. But in this regard, at the same time, China is very much concerned about democracy and human rights and the value-based political system.
China is concerned about democracy and human rights.
Yes. So what does that mean is like if there is any democratic government, that government could be like kind of the leaning to the West. So this is their concern. It's very clear. So in this regard,
They're skeptical of democratic
exactly. Exactly. So that is why this is one of the challenges for us, geopolitical situations and the concern from our neighboring country. So even though they don't like this coup is not really contribute their own interest, especially for continuations of their economic and their projects. But at the same time, so that is why I think China is very much cautious about. And another issue is like under the time of the military coup, it's now for more than 4 years. So transnational organized crimes are emerging each and every borders of Burma. So these criminal gangs are quite connected to the military junta. So we call the Boragat forces are under the military rules and quite close to them. So that kind of instability are now impact regional stability. So that is why, from our sides, we also understand the concern of the Chinese government. But at the same time, what I feel is like many of our Burman majorities feel is like the Chinese government is not very much understanding of our aspirations of Burma.
Aleksandra, you spoke already about the conflict in Ukraine. What about the appeal of the autocratic idea in Poland? I mean, do you see evidence of we know that there's Russian propaganda in that direction in every country in Europe. Do you see it in Poland as well?
Yes, so Poland actually is one of the top countries in the world when it comes to the hybrid attacks and cybersecurity attacks. So our cybersecurity forces are day in, day out, they're combating the attacks, and the fact that we don't see them, it basically means that they're working. But according to our Ministry of Digitalization, we're in top 3 states currently pushing back against sort of the Russian attacks daily. But I must say that when it comes to the sort of the autocracy and the democracy dimensions, I mean, Poland is almost this very rare beacon of hope, actually, on the map of the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, in 2023 general elections, parliamentary elections, Poland had really, I believe, that might be daring to say, but I believe it has saved itself from going into very dangerous, slippery slope Budapest.
So Poland had,
direction.
between 2015 and 2023, a kind of autocratic populist government that did push back against institutions and sought to politicize the courts, just for background.
Yes, correct. Just as Anne mentioned, we've for 8 years we had this populist government, law and justice populist government, and just so we know, according to Freedom House Index, in 2020 Poland was not considered a democracy anymore. We were considered sort of a hybrid system because of their capture of constitutional courts, of media, etc. And essentially, in 2023 we had 74.4% voter turnout. So a massive voter turnout, including mass youth mobilization, which was just so heartwarming, to see people queuing in the streets, late into the night to go and cast their vote in the ballot, to try to get our country back, because the last elections in Poland were really about the type of the system, about are we going to be a democracy still, or are we going to slide into autocracy? And actually the very reason why I put forward myself in the elections was due to that threat. So right before the elections, I had served in Ukraine. I was a humanitarian aid worker for essentially all my adult career. And my last mission was Ukraine, where I served for 12 months, running a medical mission on behalf of Intersos, an Italian humanitarian organization. And seeing, what was happening, seeing that due to the tragedy of the war in Ukraine, Poland suddenly is really becoming the NATO's eastern front line. And whether we want it or not, we have to rise to a significantly higher responsibility as a state. In times, of potential even further, sliding into autocracy, I decided to return and try and risk it, even though it was a brutal campaign. But I'm happy to report that we're back, and we'd like to also rebuild the international relations that has been lost over the previous 8 years. Yeah.
Chris, from your point of view, you've been in the U.S. Senate for many years. You've watched the rise of this autocratic world. Can you talk a little bit about how it influences U.S. politics, and also maybe just to get to the end of the conversation, can we still hope for a kind of democratic coalition to push back against it?
Yes, and I think the outcome of the elections in Poland are a reminder. Look, if you look at the American elections of 2022 and 2024, the question, does democracy matter to you? Do you really care? Not just about free and fair elections, although those are key, after our January 6th riot and the challenge to the 2020 election and its legitimacy, but does democracy deliver for you? And the answers were opposite in these two election cycles, but not by a very large margin. I'll remind you that President Trump won a very thin margin nationally, but consistently. And there were folks who didn't show up, who I was a co-chair of the Harris campaign. There's folks we were counting on showing up who didn't. And there were folks in 22 who we were afraid wouldn't show up who did. The 22 election was one where the question of was our 20 election legitimate or not was centrally on the ballot. And record numbers of people showed up in different places in different states, stood in line for hours.
Midterms.
The midterms, essentially. And elected secretaries of state, the people who supervise elections, and governors and members of Congress who were rejecting this idea that there had been a stolen election. And in 24, the key question, has democracy made you safer, healthier, stronger? Is your family participating in development? Are we more just? I would argue one of the core problems, one of the core challenges for my party, the Democratic Party, and the Biden administration was Americans who did just demonstrably benefit from things we had done, didn't believe it, didn't feel it. One of the most painful things for us was the child tax credit. It was the single most impactful intervention in terms of reducing child poverty ever by a U.S. federal government, certainly in the last 50 years. And I will never forget going to a caucus lunch and saying, it's been 6 months. How many phone calls, this is 50 cents, how many phone calls have you gotten from your constituency saying, wow, this is amazing? Because in my state of 1 million people, it was 20 calls, and they were all negative. It was an innovative way for us to provide monthly stipends. We're not a social democratic country, so this would not strike any European country as new. But for very low-income families with children, we were providing them a direct monthly income. And the impact on child poverty was dramatic, and the consequences for healthcare and education significant. And yet it didn't move the needle at all. And I could give you 10 more examples. And there's a lot of arguments as to why, and a lot of things that my party has to do to look hard at it. But the point you raised, I think, is the central one. Across Africa, across the world, but in particular in places where China is offering a competing model and the United States is offering a model of partnership and development, China says, you don't need to be lectured to about human rights. We will simply provide you with financing and just give us some access to your ports and your railroads and your mines. But we're going to be your partner. And we show up and say, we want you to have a free and independent media, have free and independent courts, and have elections regularly, and we want to help with development from the ground up. And both countries have uneven records. I'd like to believe that over the decades that we've done development work throughout the world, it is more than not to advance and promote the interests of the people we're working in partnership with, not to extract value for the United States. What I fear most about our current environment and some of the current conversations, particularly with Ukraine, is that instead of supporting Ukraine in its fight for democracy and freedom, we're now putting on the table, comma, if you give us access to your minerals. That, to me, runs exactly against what we've tried to be about for decades, which is we're not here because we care about your minerals. We're not here because we want access to your natural resources. We're here because as a democracy that is about to celebrate 250 years, we recognize the American Revolution never would have succeeded without help from Poland, without help from France, without help from Germany. If you walk out the front door of the White House, the residency of the American president, there are statues on the four corners of that Central Park. None of those are Americans. They are volunteers who came to help the American Revolution win, just as people from around the world are going into Ukraine and helping arm and train and equip Ukrainian troops and helping support Ukraine in their fight for freedom. We never would have succeeded in our struggle against colonialism without Kosciuszko and Pulaski.
Kościuszko.
Forgive me. I always mispronounce Polish names. Von Steuben and Rochambeau and Lafayette. And I was raised on this history that our democracy depended on the help of others. And I'll simply close by saying the pernicious, malevolent influence of these things and social media on what people believe democracy is and how it's delivering for them, and the profound and pernicious influence of misinformation driven by state actors, I worry is corrosive both to American democracy and the whole concept of the alignment between the elements of democracy and what it delivers around the world. But please realize that democracy is a team effort that will only be sustainable and successful if we all continue to contribute to each other's struggles.
Thank you. You've actually confirmed one of my theses, which is that I actually believe that although we thought for a long time that American democracy, that NATO was all about Americans helping Europeans remain democratic, I now look back on history and I think actually America putting the idea of democracy at the center of its foreign policy, at least in Europe, had a huge, important effect on American democracy domestically. And it was unacknowledged for a long time. And I think it's become clear in retrospect. So we have exactly 5 minutes left. Maybe I could just ask the others to respond to the idea of democratic coalitions, and you each have 1 minute, okay? To respond to the idea of a democratic coalition, could you just think about the question of whether your country being in alliance with other democracies, does it matter? Are there joint projects you can do together? Obviously, this is a topic for another 3-hour conversation, but we have 4 minutes and 59 seconds. So maybe start with you, Aleksandra, briefly.
Sure, absolutely, yes. So coalitions are critical, and Poland currently is happy to lead as well for the first time, to actually serve, lead, and deliver, especially on the defense side, because liberal democracies need to grow teeth. We have to stop becoming so soft. We have to understand that we are under threat and we are under attack, as much as we might want to not fully appreciate that. So we have to ramp up our defense spending. We have to seriously invest in deterrence. And we have to also understand that the battlegrounds for democracy are interconnected. So whatever is happening today in Minsk in Belarus, whatever is happening in Kiev in Ukraine, whatever is happening in Myanmar, in Burma, whatever is happening in Poland, these are interconnected battlegrounds. And we need to currently, those that believe, in the values of democracy, of freedom, of the pursuit of happiness, need to work together tirelessly and ceaselessly and daily for this world order not to cease to exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Min?
Yeah, actually, while I'm here, it looks far away from geographically issues. Our location is just very close to the big countries like China and India. In our region, it's not that much democratically favorable locations in our Asia. So, but the reason why I am here is like we need coalitions, we need friends in order to promote democracy and freedom in our country. Myanmar is only one country in the region that fight against military rules and fighting for freedom and democracy consistently. So that is why I do believe and agree like coalitions and alliance is really very important for us. And so that is why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Zanetor.
Thank you. I think it has to be a multifaceted approach. In Ghana, what we have interparliamentary friendships. So we have parliamentary friendships with different countries across the world, Asia, Europe, the US, the whole of the continent. This is one of the ways in which we actually bring the high-level strategic thinking to the grassroots, because each representative deals directly with their people, and that's how you disseminate proper information, number one. The second thing as well is that we need to have a little bit more ethical thinking behind some of these trade agreements, because if the West says to different countries on the continent, yes, we want you to be democratic, we want you to follow all these rules, but there is this complete imbalance with the way we have the benefits of exporting our resources. Instead of being allowed to add value, you're only permitted to export the raw material. It means that the status quo will never change. It means you'll constantly be at the bottom of the food chain, which also raises the question is, are our friends being helpful to us? Because friendship is supposed to be supportive.
So you need a democratic alliance that's not just about big ideas. You want it to represent
that's right.
a fair
practically how it lifts people up, so that then when we're saying we are democracies, we are saying we're democracies on as even a keel as possible.
Right.
Thank you.
So would you like the last one further thought on the usefulness or otherwise of democratic coalitions, whether it's to fight kleptocracy, whether it's to regulate social media, whatever?
Look, the whole point, the thread through this conversation is we have to be awake about how clear and present the danger is of this coalition of autocracies and how much they are on the march, of how many people around the world are willing to take risks and stand up and speak out against oppressive government regimes and the costs of coup. And how, frankly, our engagement in the world needs to be even-handed and balanced and to change from historic patterns and move forward. Bluntly, I needed this encouragement. It is a reminder that democracy is not in any way uniquely American. And at times, America does best when it listens more than it talks and when it is humble about its history. And the four of you, have reminded you of the strength of that. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I mean, I will say in my 23 remaining seconds, I will say one of the things that I've learned in traveling around the world is the power of democratic language that very often comes from people who have never been to the United States, don't know the history of the United States, don't know anything about Europe, have never read John Stuart Mill, just the instinctively people tend to understand, they have an instinct for justice, and they understand that it's unfair when the government decides things and they have no influence. And they understand that courts shouldn't be biased, and they understand that media shouldn't lie. And it doesn't need that much sophistication. And of course, this is why the autocratic world is so afraid of this language, because it can be, without, you don't even have to make a big statement about universal ideas. It's just people instinctively want these things. And then the question for, those of us who are in politics or who write about it or who work on it is to find a way to channel it and give people that sense in the modern world. Anyway, thank you all very much.